She was 22, dismissed from service, and without a roof over her head in the soot-stained manufacturing town of Greyfell. She had no family, no prospects, and no plan, just a worn woolen shawl, her small terrier Pip, and the £2 she had managed to save from a life of careful economy. And with that sum, she bought a ruined manor on the edge of the moors, a place called Blackwood. But what nobody in the town knew, what the auctioneer who sold it for a pittance did not suspect, was that hidden behind a paneled wall was a door no one had dared to open for 50 years, a door that held a secret that would change her life forever. Settle in with us for this story, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Sarah Calloway's life had been shaped by the quiet teachings of loss and the steady cadence of work. She was born in the parish of St. Giles, an orphan whose parents were little more than names in a dusty ledger, taken by the cholera that swept through the weavers' district in '48. Her early years were spent in the county workhouse, a place of thin blankets, thinner gruel, and the constant, chilling draft that seemed to seep from the stone walls themselves. It was there she learned that to be silent was to be invisible, and to be invisible was to be safe. She learned to watch, to listen, and to mend. She could darn a sock so finely, the repair was a mere shadow on the wool, a skill that first brought her to the attention of the matron. But her true education began when, at 14, she was placed in service at the home of Mr. Croft, a minor industrialist, under the charge of his housekeeper, Mrs. Elspeth Gable. Mrs. Gable was a widow, a woman whose movements were as economical and precise as her speech. She saw in Sarah not a workhouse girl to be pitied or bullied, but a pair of capable hands and a mind that was quick to learn. It was Mrs. Gable who taught her the true arts of the household, not as drudgery, but as a craft. She taught Sarah how to build a coal fire that would burn slow and hot through a winter's night, banking it with damp slack. She taught her how to render tallow for candles, how to preserve summer fruit in sugar and vinegar, and how to read a household ledger, her finger tracing the columns of income and expenditure. "A house is a body, Sarah," she would say, her voice low and steady. "It must be kept warm, fed, and its accounts must balance, or it will sicken." Most importantly, Mrs. Gable taught her carpentry. In the damp cellars and rattling attics of the Croft house, she showed Sarah how to plane a sticking door, how to replace a sash cord, and how to mix lime mortar to point the crumbling brickwork in the scullery. "Never depend on a man for what your own two hands can learn to do," was her constant refrain. For 6 years, Mrs. Gable was the closest thing to a mother Sarah had ever known. When she died suddenly of a lung fever, the warmth seemed to drain from the house overnight. Mrs. Gable left Sarah her most prized possession, a small, sterling silver thimble, worn smooth and thin on one side from decades of pushing a needle through heavy linen. It was a simple, practical thing, but to Sarah, it was a talisman, a tangible piece of the only person who had ever shown her unconditional kindness and respect. It lived in the pocket of her apron, a cool, solid weight against her palm. The end of Sarah's time at the Croft house came not with a bang, but with the quiet, administrative cruelty of a new order. 6 months after Mrs. Gable's passing, Mr. Croft remarried. His new wife was a woman from London, younger than him by 2 decades, with ideas about how a modern household should be run. She saw the old ways, Mrs. Gable's ways, as inefficient and provincial. She saw Sarah, with her quiet competence and her deep knowledge of the house's quirks, not as an asset, but as a silent judgment on her own authority. The dismissal was delivered on a Tuesday morning, after the breakfast things had been cleared. Mrs. Croft summoned Sarah to the morning room, a place Sarah usually only entered to dust. The new mistress did not ask her to sit. She stood by the window, looking out at her newly planted rose garden, her back to the girl she was about to unmake. "Miss Calloway," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of any warmth, "as you know, I am making some changes to the management of the staff. I have decided to bring in a new housekeeper from my previous establishment. Your services will therefore no longer be required." There was no fault cited, No word of dissatisfaction with her work. It was a simple, cold statement of fact. Sarah stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency that bought nothing but scorn. "I see, ma'am," she said, her own voice steady. "When would you like me to leave?" Mrs. Croft finally turned, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise at Sarah's lack of protest, in her eyes. "Your position is terminated as of this morning. You will be paid a week's wages in lieu of notice. You may have 1 hour to gather your belongings." A single-pound note and a few shillings were laid on the polished mahogany table, beside a letter of reference that Sarah knew would be technically correct, but emotionally barren. A death knell for any hope of a similar position. She did not argue. She did not beg. She gave a slight, formal curtsy, took the money and the letter, and walked from the room. Upstairs, in her small attic room, she moved with the efficiency Mrs. Gable had taught her. She folded her 2 spare dresses and aprons, her underthings, and wrapped her copy of Pilgrim's Progress in a kerchief. She placed Mrs. Gable's silver thimble carefully into a small wooden box. Her entire worldly existence fit into a single carpet bag. From under her bed, she coaxed her small, scruffy terrier, Pip, a stray she had rescued from a kicking drayman a year prior. He was a creature of indeterminate breeding, all wire-haired loyalty and intelligent brown eyes. With Pip tucked under one arm and her bag in the other hand, she walked down the back stairs and out of the yard, never once looking back at the house that had been the only home she had ever known. The journey began at the edge of Greyfell, where the cobbled streets gave way to rutted mud lanes and the perpetual haze of coal smoke thinned, revealing a pale, indifferent sky. Sarah walked with a steady, unhurried pace, the carpet bag growing heavier with each mile. Pip trotted beside her, his nose to the ground, occasionally glancing up as if to confirm she was still there. The air was damp with the coming of late autumn, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The manufacturing town, with its clatter and grime, fell away behind her, replaced by a rolling landscape of bare fields, stark stone walls, and the distant, purple-gray smudge of the moors. She had £2, 5 shillings, and a handful of pence. It was a fortune, and nothing at all. It was enough to keep her in bread and cheese for a few weeks, to pay for a bed in a cheap lodging house. But it was not enough to build a life. Her reference, as she had suspected, was a masterpiece of damning with faint praise. Sarah Calloway is honest, sober, and diligent in her duties. It omitted any mention of her skills in household repair, her knowledge of preserving, or her thriftiness, the very qualities Mrs. Gable had so carefully nurtured. It was the reference of a scullery maid, not a potential housekeeper. She spent the first night in a farmer's barn, burrowed into the hay for warmth, with Pip curled against her side, the farmer's wife having taken pity on her and offered a bowl of broth and a heel of bread in exchange for Sarah mending a torn horse blanket. The needle, guided by Mrs. Gable's thimble, felt familiar and steadying in her hand. For 2 days she walked, heading north, with no destination in mind other than away. The physical act of walking was a comfort, a simple rhythm of left, right, that kept the rising panic at bay. The world was reduced to the crunch of her boots on the graveled track, the chill of the wind on her cheeks, and the small, warm presence of her dog. On the 3rd day, sheltering from a sudden downpour in the doorway of a public house in a small market town, she saw the notice tacked to the door. It was an announcement from the county clerk. An auction of properties seized for non-payment of taxes. Most were small, forgotten parcels of land. A waterlogged half-acre, a quarryman's abandoned cottage, with a collapsed roof. But one entry caught her eye. Blackwood Manor, freehold. Dwelling house with outbuildings and approxies, 20 acres. There was a note appended. Property sold as seen. Structure considered derelict and unsafe for habitation. Sarah read the words again. Manor. The word itself was from another world, a world of wealth and stability she had only ever observed from the servant's side of the door. She knew it was a fool's hope, but it was a hope nonetheless. She found the auction was to be held the very next day in the town hall. With a shilling, she bought a loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese, and that night, she and Pip slept under the shelter of an old stone bridge, the sound of the river, a low murmur in the darkness. The auction was held in a cold, wood-paneled room in the town hall, smelling of damp wool and old paper. It was attended by a handful of local farmers and businessmen, their faces impassive and shrewd. Sarah sat at the back, her shawl pulled tight, Pip concealed in a fold of her skirt. She was invisible, a ghost in a room of solid men. The auctioneer, a man with a florid face and a booming voice, moved quickly through the smaller lots. A field was sold for £5, a tiny cottage for 10. Then he announced, Lot 12, Blackwood Manor. A low murmur went through the room. One farmer leaned to another and whispered, loud enough for Sarah to hear, Place is cursed. No one's lived there since the Thorne family died out. Roof's gone, and they say the walls are green with damp. The auctioneer made his pitch, though his voice lacked conviction. A substantial stone-built property, gentlemen, in a commanding position with views across the moor, in need of some considerable repair, but a fine opportunity for the right investor. He opened the bidding at £10. Silence. He dropped it to 5. Still, no one moved. The men looked at their boots, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the auctioneer. The place was a local legend, a byword for decay and bad luck. Finally, with an air of exasperation, he said, Do I have any offer at all? The Crown requires the debt to be settled. Any offer to clear the taxes? He scanned the room, his eyes passing over Sarah, without seeing her. £2, he said, a note of desperation in his voice. Will anyone give me £2 for the freehold of Blackwood Manor? In the heavy silence, Sarah stood up. Her voice, when it came, was clear but small. I will. Every head in the room turned to look at her. The auctioneer stared, nonplussed. A young woman, clearly in service, with a dog peeking out of her skirts. He seemed about to dismiss her, but the law was the law. £2 from the young lady at the back. Any advance on £2? There was a collective shifting of feet. A few suppressed chuckles. No one spoke. Sold, the auctioneer said, banging his gavel with a final, resounding thwack, to the young lady for £2. An hour later, Sarah walked out of the solicitor's office with a heavy, folded deed, the paper brittle with age. Her purse was empty, save for a few shillings. She was the owner of Blackwood Manor. It took her the rest of the day to walk there, following a winding lane that climbed steadily towards the moor. The manor appeared suddenly, as the lane crested a hill. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a house. It was a skeleton. The roof had fallen in over one entire wing, and the slates that remained on the central block were a jagged, broken spine. The windows were black, empty sockets, most of them boarded over, the others shattered. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, covered the gray stone walls, prying the blocks apart. It stood alone, a monument to decay, with the vast, empty moor stretching out behind it. But it was stone. It was hers. And as the cold evening mist began to rise, Sarah Calloway, holding her deed and her dog, walked towards the ruin that was now her home. For the first few days, Sarah and Pip lived in what had once been a stable. The roof was mostly intact, and she was able to patch the worst of the holes with salvaged timber and tarpaulin she found in a collapsed shed. She swept the stone floor clean of debris and built a small, contained fire in a corner, venting the smoke through a gap in the wall. It was a meager shelter, but it was dry, and it was hers. During the day, she explored her domain. The house was a labyrinth of decay. Plaster had fallen from the walls in great sheets, revealing the lath beneath. A fine green mold grew on every surface, touched by the persistent damp. Floors were soft with rot, and the grand staircase in the main hall had collapsed entirely, its steps lying in a jumble on the flagstones below. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone, rot, and the ghosts of 100 cold winters. Yet, beneath the ruin, Sarah could see the house's good bones. The stone walls were 3 feet thick, built to withstand the moorland gales. The oak beams in the main hall, though dark with age, were solid. It was a place built to last, and it had been defeated not by a single catastrophe, but by slow, relentless neglect. It was Pip who made the discovery. On the fourth day, as Sarah was methodically clearing rubble from the main hall, the little dog began to act strangely. He became fixated on a section of oak paneling along the west wall, whining and scratching at the wood, his whole body trembling with a strange excitement. Sarah tried to call him away, but he refused to move, pawing insistently at a single, dark, unadorned panel near the floor. Curious, Sarah ran her hands over the wood. It was cold and solid. She tapped it, and it sounded no different from the panels beside it. But Pip was adamant. He let out a sharp bark and scratched again, his claws making faint white marks on the dark wood. Trusting the dog's instinct, Sarah fetched the heavy iron pry bar she had found in the stables. Working carefully, she inserted the flattened end into the fine seam between the panels. She put her weight against it. The old wood groaned in protest. Then, with a sharp crack, the panel splintered and broke free. Behind it was not stone, as she had expected, but the clear outline of a door. It was small and low, made of thick oak planks, bound with black iron straps. There was no handle, no keyhole, no visible latch. It was set flush into the stone of the main wall, and the gaps around its edges were sealed with a hard, gray substance that looked like old mortar. It was a door designed never to be opened. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, a mixture of fear and profound excitement. This was a secret, a forgotten thing. This was the heart of the house's silence. It took her the rest of the day. Using a heavy hammer and a cold chisel from the stable, she began to chip away at the mortar. It was slow, arduous work. Chips of stone and mortar flew, stinging her face. Her arms and back ached with the strain. But with each blow of the hammer, her determination grew. As dusk fell, the last of the seal crumbled away. She put the pry bar into the crack she had made and pulled. The door resisted. Then, with a deep, grating groan of ancient hinges, it swung inwards into absolute darkness, releasing a puff of air that was dry, cool, and smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Holding a lit candle, her heart pounding, Sarah peered into the opening. It was not a room or a passage, but a small, man-sized alcove, barely 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, lined with dressed stone. A priest hole. And sitting on the stone floor, untouched by damp or time, were 2 chests. One a small, heavy box bound in iron, the other a larger one, of plain, dark wood. With trembling hands, Sarah dragged the 2 chests from the hidden alcove into the dim light of the great hall. The smaller box was incredibly heavy for its size, and locked. The larger wooden chest, however, was secured only by a simple brass latch. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on top of a stack of papers, was a leather-bound ledger and a sealed letter. The ink on the front faded, but still legible. To whomever should find this place of my own making. Her fingers shook as she broke the wax seal. The letter was written in a neat, controlled hand, the script of an educated man. It was dated October 1821. "My name is Elias Thorne," it began. "I was a merchant of wool, and this house, Blackwood, was my pride. I write this in my 63rd year, the last of my line. The fever took my wife, Eleanor, and my 2 sons, James and Thomas, within a fortnight this past spring. My relations now circle this house like vultures, waiting for me to die so they may claim what is mine. They will not have it. They will not turn this home, filled with the memory of my family, into coin for their own frivolous lives. I have, therefore, devised this plan. The bulk of my liquid assets I have converted to gold coin, which you will find in the iron box. The key is taped to the underside of this wooden chest's lid. There are 500 gold sovereigns within. It is my life's work. In this chest, you will also find the unencumbered deed of freehold for this house, and its 20 surrounding acres, as well as ledgers detailing the house's construction, and a map of the wellspring on the north pasture, which never runs dry. Use this wealth as you see fit. My only request is that you do not let this house fall entirely to ruin. It was a good, strong home once. Perhaps, with your help, It can be again. I have walled up the door behind me. My grief is a prison of its own, and I have chosen to make its walls from the stone of my own home. May God have mercy on my soul, and may this inheritance bring you the security that was stolen from mine. Elias Thorne. Sarah sat back on the dusty flagstones, the letter shaking in her hand. 500 sovereigns. It was an unimaginable fortune. She found the key, unlocked the iron box, and lifted the lid. The gold coins gleamed in the candlelight, a hoard of captured sons. It was not just money, it was a future, it was safety. It was the means to honor the last wish of a man dead for 40 years. The next morning, she walked the 6 miles back to town. She did not go to the bank. Instead, she went to the yard of a man Mrs. Gable had once spoken of, a retired stonemason named Arthur Finch. She found him splitting logs, an old man with hands as gnarled as oak roots, but a clear, steady eye. She explained that she had come into a small inheritance and had purchased blackwood. She needed help. She didn't want a crew of workmen. She wanted one man to teach her. Mr. Finch looked at her worn dress and her determined face, and then he looked at the gold sovereign she placed in his palm. He bit it, a flicker of astonishment in his eyes. "I'll help you, lass," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But the work will be hard." "I am not afraid of work," Sarah replied. The rebuilding of Blackwood Manor began not with grand designs, but with the fundamental need for shelter. The first and most urgent task was the roof. Under Mr. Finch's tutelage, Sarah learned the slow, rhythmic craft of the slater. They started with the main block of the house, the section that was damaged but not collapsed. Mr. Finch taught her how to build a sturdy scaffolding from salvaged timbers, lashing them together with thick rope. He showed her how to test the old roof lathes, prying away the rotten ones, and replacing them with new wood she bought from the timber yard in town. He taught her the language of the tools, the slater's hammer with its sharp, pointed pick for punching nail holes, the slater's ripper, a long, flat blade for cutting the nails of broken slates to remove them. Sarah spent days on the roof, high above the moor, her skirts tied up around her legs for safety. She learned to split new Welsh slates with a sharp tap of the hammer, the stone parting with a clean, satisfying crack. She learned to lay them in overlapping courses, nailing them to the lathes with copper nails that would not rust, each slate covering the nail holes of the one below it. The work was physically demanding, leaving her muscles aching and her hands raw. But with each slate she laid, she felt a fierce, quiet pride. She was not just repairing a roof, she was building a shield against the world. While they worked, the community, initially suspicious, began to take notice. Smoke was rising from a stable chimney at Blackwood, and the strange girl who had bought the ruin was on its roof from dawn till dusk, working alongside old Arthur Finch. Curiosity turned into a cautious, practical form of support. One afternoon, a farmer's wife, Mrs. Albright, a stout woman with kind eyes, arrived with a basket. In it was a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a crock of stew, and a dozen eggs. "A growing girl needs her sustenance," she said, by way of explanation, looking up at the roof. "And a man of Arthur's age needs his, too." Sarah, touched by the unsolicited kindness, offered her a shilling, but Mrs. Albright waved it away. "Pay me back by getting that place fit for winter," she said with a nod. A few days later, her son, a quiet young man named Thomas, appeared with a cart full of logs from a fallen oak. "For your fire," he said, stacking them neatly against the stable wall. Sarah, remembering the skills Mrs. Gable had taught her, offered to mend his torn work coat in return. He accepted, and a silent barter was struck. As the roof neared completion, Mr. Finch taught her how to mix lime mortar, a slow and patient process. They built a fire in a shallow pit and slaked quicklime with water from the well that Sarah, using Elias Thorne's map, had uncovered and cleared. The lime hissed and steamed, transforming into a soft, putty-like substance. They mixed it with sand and horsehair, and with it, they repointed the gables and reset the ridge tiles, sealing the roof against the wind and rain. On the day they finished, a month after they had started, Sarah and Mr. Finch stood on the ground and looked up. The new roof was a tapestry of gray and purple stone, solid and beautiful against the autumn sky. For the first time in 50 years, Blackwood Manor was watertight. With the roof secure, Sarah moved her efforts inside. She chose 2 rooms on the ground floor to make her own, the kitchen and the small parlor next to it. These would be her fortress against the coming winter. The kitchen was a cavernous space, with a flagstone floor and a huge, blackened hearth. The first task was to clear the chimney, which was choked with decades of fallen leaves, twigs, and the nests of jackdaws. Thomas, Mrs. Albright's son, helped her. He climbed onto the newly repaired roof with a set of borrowed chimney-sweeping rods and a heavy weight, while Sarah stood below, her hair covered, as a cascade of black, dusty debris fell into the hearth. When they were done, she built the first fire in the great fireplace. The old flue drew perfectly, and the sight of flames leaping up the chimney filled her with a profound sense of victory. The warmth began to push back against the deep, cellular chill of the house. Next, she tackled the plaster. The old lime plaster was crumbling and covered in a fine green mold. With a scraper and a wire brush, she spent days chipping it all away, back to the bare stone walls. It was messy, dusty work, but as the clean, honest stone was revealed, she felt as if she were letting the house breathe again. She bought sacks of lime and sand, and with the skills Mr. Finch had taught her, she began to replaster. She learned the feel of the hawk and trowel, the sweeping motion required to lay a smooth, even coat. Her first attempts were clumsy, but she persisted, and gradually, the new, pale plaster spread across the walls, clean and bright. People from the village began to find reasons to visit. Mr. Finch, who now considered himself her unofficial guardian, would stop by with advice. Mrs. Albright brought her seedlings from her own garden for a small kitchen plot Sarah had started to dig near the door. The local vicar, a kindly man named Mr. Davies, called to welcome her to the parish, bringing a Bible and a jar of his wife's marmalade. He was astonished at the work she had done. "You have a formidable spirit, Miss Calloway," he remarked, looking at her plastered walls. Sarah was slowly being woven into the fabric of the community, not through conversation or social calls, but through the shared language of work and mutual respect. They knew her not by her history, but by the evidence of her labor. She was no longer the strange girl from the auction. She was Miss Calloway of Blackwood, the woman who was bringing the dead house back to life. As winter set in, her small corner of the manor was a haven of warmth and light. She had reglazed the windows in the parlor and kitchen, patiently cutting the glass and setting it with putty. She had scrubbed the flagstone floors with lye and sand until they shone. She had a bed, a table, and 2 chairs, bought from a carpenter in the town. Smoke rose daily from her chimney, a signal to the valley that Blackwood was inhabited once more. She was a part of the landscape. She had a place. Spring arrived late on the moor, but when it came with a gentle insistence. The gorse on the hillsides bloomed a startling yellow, and the air grew soft with the promise of new growth. Sarah stood at the door of her kitchen, looking out at the world she had built. The stone walls of the manor, now free of their suffocating ivy, seemed to soak up the morning sun. The new slate roof was a dark, solid line against the pale blue sky. Inside, her 2 rooms were a sanctuary of order and warmth. A fire burned low in the hearth, and a kettle was beginning to sing. Pip lay stretched out on the rag rug she had made during the long winter evenings, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the floor. Her life had found its own steady cadence, marked by the seasons and the demands of the house and land. She had cleared the walled garden, discovering raspberry canes and rhubarb crowns slumbering under a thicket of brambles. Mrs. Albright had shown her how to prune the old, gnarled apple trees, and they were now covered in a blush of pink and white blossoms. Thomas had helped her plow a small section of the north pasture, where she had planted potatoes and oats, following the advice in an old almanac she'd found in Elias Thorne's chest. She was not just a homeowner, she was a custodian. She felt a deep connection to the solitary man who had left her this legacy. She often thought of him, a ghost of grief walled up in his own home, In her parlor, on the mantelpiece above the fire, she had placed two small objects side by side. One was Mrs. Gable's silver thimble, its surface worn smooth by a lifetime of practical care. The other was a small wooden bird, intricately carved, that she had found at the bottom of Elias Thorne's chest, a small, forgotten piece of his life. To Sarah, they represented the two people who had, in their own ways, saved her. Mrs. Gable, who had given her the skills to work, and Mr. Thorne, who had given her the means and the place to do so. They were strangers to each other, a housekeeper and a wool merchant. But in her life, they were intertwined. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer the hands of a servant. They were calloused and strong, the nails short and often edged with dirt. They were the hands of a woman who knew how to lay a slate, mix mortar, plant a seed, and build a life from a ruin. Sarah Calloway was 23 years old, and she was home. She had arrived in this place with £2 to her name, and she had spent it on a pile of stones that everyone else had abandoned. It was, she knew with a certainty, that settled deep in her bones, the best £2 she had ever spent. She had been 22 and homeless, a dismissed servant, with nothing but a few shillings and a small, loyal dog. With that meager sum, she bought a ruin that the world had forgotten, a place of collapsed roofs and ghost stories. But what no one saw was the strength in her hands and the quiet hope in her heart. They saw decay, but she saw good stone. And in finding a hidden door, she found not just a fortune, but a future, and a connection to a past that gave her the power to rebuild. Thank you for joining us for her story. If you've been inspired, please consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who might need a reminder that value can be found in the most unexpected places. And for all of us, we leave you with this thought. What have you, in your own life, overlooked that might just be waiting for a second chance?